Bienvenidas. Welcome everyone to our session for the American Anthropological Association Conference. The title of our presentation or conversation is Representing Truth and Responsibility to Our Communities when Parents of Color Share Their Perspectives about Bilingualism. My name is Sera Hernandez, and I use the pronouns she, her, and ella. I also am with a blurred background with long brown hair, and I'm at San Diego State University, and I also am wearing a white top with black stripes, and I'm super pleased to be here with you all to introduce our panel. And I also identify as a Latina. So a little bit about our panel. We have some amazing scholars from around the country coming together to be in dialogue around papers that they have written for the conference, and also they'll be sharing some updates on where these works are. We have Adriana Alvarez from the University of Colorado, Denver. We have Claudia Cervantes Soon from Arizona State University, who is here with us in spirit. Sofia Chaparro from the University of Colorado at Denver. Suzanne Garcia-Mateus from California State University, Monterey Bay. Idalia Nunez from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And our discussant is Patricia Baquedano Lopez from the University of Berkeley, California. And with that, I'll pass it over to Suzanne.
Good afternoon or good morning, whatever time it may be at this moment. Thank you for the introduction, Sera. So we wanted to start off with just an informal conversation and share a little bit about how we came together as a panel. I'll share a little later about my own work with this panel, but I wanted to start off about why I wanted to bring these amazing women together for this particular topic. I bring my identity into this work as a mother, as a Latina mother raising multilingual Latinx kids. And I've seen through my own experiences in dual language schools, the inequities that affect children of color, and I saw it with my own children. And then as an academic, I had that view also with the inequities that are taking place in the schooling of our students of color in bilingual programs. And I really wanted to just bring this group of women together to share their own views as scholars, as madres, as tias, whatever role you bring to this work, to share our own perspectives as women of color in academia, but also as some of us may have other identities that we're bringing into this work focused on bilingualism in our schools here in the US. And I wanted to add one more thing. I wanted to share a little bit about how I identify. I identify as ella, she, her, and hers. I identify as Chicana, Latina. I have medium length brown hair, and I'm wearing a bright blue blouse. And there's like a beige background behind me. So to that end, I want to open up discussion with our participants about the papers that we wrote for this panel. I'd like to invite Adriana perhaps to share in talking about your paper.
Hi, hello everyone. It's so good to be part of this panel. My name is Adriana Alvarez, and I use ella, she, her, hers pronouns. I identify as Latina, Mexicana, and Mexican American. I have long brown hair up in a ponytail, and I am wearing a striped sweater with gray and blue. And I am faculty at CU Denver. And I'd love to get us started with this conversation. And I wanted just to share a little bit about how this work has evolved, actually, because in a study in which we were looking at trust and distrust, the relationships between Latinx families from immigrant backgrounds and 2 school districts in Colorado, and the inequities, marginalization that families from immigrant backgrounds face in schools are very well documented, and we know this in this group. And so how the lens that we bring to this work, and I'll get to the aspect of bilingualism, was that we analyzed these issues of trust and distrust using a framework that specifically conceptualizes distrust and trust and dignity as essential pillars towards building and strengthening family-school relationships. And so through these approaches, they're very intentional. And so the lens that this kind of like theoretical framework brings is that in order to address trust, and we hear all the time schools having this goal, we need to build trust, we need to build trust. And this lens is really saying you need to address distrust first in order to build that trust. Not only address, but heal it. And so one of the findings that I really wanted to share with this panel was that the co-occurrences of the parents, we interviewed many parents into districts and teachers as well, was that the occurrences of distrust and bilingualism or language was very, very high, meaning that the experiences that these parents were sharing in 2 school districts in Colorado, one in a rural setting and another one in a suburban setting, was just incredibly high, the way that the parents, as they were sharing their experiences of distrust, language became one of the factors that was leading the parents to feel this distrust. And so this work is really looking at what's the role of bilingualism and how schools are framing that, and especially the parents' bilingualism and the home languages that they're bringing and the students are bringing. And so in this work, and I don't want to take over, and I want to open it up to conversation since that's our format. But here, this paper is addressing that in order to heal the distrust that families are experiencing in schools, we have to address the language issue and the way that their languages is positioned or not in the schools. And so I'll stop there and open it up for conversation from other colleagues. And I'm happy to give more details. I know it wasn't too much, but I know we really want to have a conversation. So I think this paper is really looking at bilingualism as an issue of distrust in schools that is causing these tensions between Latinx families and schools.
I actually have a question for you, Adriana. This is Sophia speaking, and I identify as Latina or Mexican American. My pronouns are she and hers. I have curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a peach-colored dress with blue earrings. Thank you, Adriana, for sharing some of your work around trust and mistrust or distrust, which is fascinating. And what do you mean when you say language? Was it like when people were bilingual, they distrusted more, or when nobody was able to speak Spanish, they distrusted more? You're on mute.
I'm sorry. Okay, yes, so that's a very good question. Thank you, Sophia. And so let me give you an example. So we asked parents to share, like, what have been some experiences of distrust that you have had in schools? And one example was a parent needing a translator for a parent-teacher conference. And the translator, the parent had a question, and the question was, how can I be more involved in the school? How can I better support my children at this site, at this school? And this is at the rural school in Colorado. And the translator turned to the parent and said, you really need to learn English. So it was the translator was telling the parent. And so this is an experience of distrust that the parent was sharing with us, as far as, and so those codes, language and distrust. So that's an example, and maybe that helps clarify of what I mean when we speak of those instances of distrust and language and bilingualism. And so, and I'll share more examples in a minute. I want to make sure. Yeah. Does that help, Sophie?
Sí, claro. Ujú.
Sí.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, maybe Idalia and I can share a little bit about our combined paper. So initially, I had interviewed a group of parents who shared with me that they're from Mexico, about a fraction of them, and the other fraction were like myself, born and raised in the US with immigrant parents. And they were all part of a dual language program. And what was interesting in thinking about this trust factor is that when I interviewed my parents, the ones from Mexico really just described beautiful experiences of being Spanish speakers. And it was almost too perfect of a story that I began to wonder about their vulnerabilities and actually sharing other aspects of it. Whereas my second gen parents were very vocal and really described their children's bilingualism as a right. Some even said, I'll speak it louder on purpose in Spanish. But I came at this work from a theoretical framework that focused on language policy. And then more conversations I had with Idalia, both as parents, but also as scholars, we decided to combine our data and just highlight some of the ways that the parents were bringing in their cultural and language practices in the raising of bilingual children. And we found it so interesting. And I like the way we called them critical translanguaging pedagogues. I don't know if Idalia, you want to say a little bit more about what we found.
Hi, so I should probably introduce myself, right? So my name is Idalia Nunez, and my pronouns are ella, she, her, and hers. I identify as Mexican, as Chicana, as Latina, and from the borderlands. So right now I have short, dark hair, and I'm wearing a white and blue striped blouse. And I am faculty at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So a little bit about, like Suzanne mentioned, we combined our data sets and looked at what families were saying, in particular madres de origen mexicano. I had experiences with families transfronterizas from the Texas-Mexico borderlands. And so from my data, I came to learn and really appreciate las historias que platicaban las mamás de los niños que estaban participando como parte del proyecto. But they were really sharing this critical perspective that came out of being and navigating both spaces. That they were Latinas, but in the US, but they had experiences on both sides of the border, but they had experienced schooling in Mexico, but now they were seeing their children go through the US system. And so they had very different and very critical perspectives of, what was working, what was not working, where they saw the discrepancies, where they saw the inequities in language was a big piece. And they recognized that. They recognized, that English was privileged, even in a space where there was a vibrant bilingual community. And so it was really interesting to learn how they were resisting that particular discourse at home. And they were very active about it. They were very strategic about it. And they did it in ways that I kept thinking, why are we not learning from them? Why are we not privileging their pedagogies? Because it gave us a completely different understanding about how language is very rich and concrete when we do it in context, when we do it with people, when we do it with this cultural lens. And so I really appreciated coming together with Suzanne's sort of perspective, because it gave us really this nice focus as madres who are raising bilinguals, who are dealing with a lot of the similar issues that the moms were talking about, and really appreciating, learning from them and seeing how we as madres are doing things similar, how we can learn from them, how we can draw on that, and how those stories have a lot of power to share.
And quite frankly, it's similar to how we were raised, right? Idalia and I have talked multiple times about how the ways we were raised aren't necessarily aligned with what's valued in academia, like reading a book with your kid, like in bed. I don't have memories of my parents doing that, and yet here I am with a PhD, right?
Sometimes schooling kind of does this work to help you like unlearn those things that are so important. And to me, eso es lo que más me dolió de este proyecto, darme cuenta de todo lo que hicieron mi familia, igual que ellos. And I had lost that at some point through the schooling process.
Mhm.
And so having this privilege to go and learn from them was just powerful because it reaffirmed who I was, my family practice, las prácticas de mi mamá, de mi abuela, de todos, you know, it was just so powerful.
That's beautiful. I can't wait to read your work, Susana and Idalia. I see so much parallels with, so many parallels with my own work in highlighting the experiences of parents of color. And my context is one particular two-way immersion program that came about in a large northeastern city in Philadelphia. And I analyzed how it was a product of these larger forces of gentrification coming together with an already existing stream of immigration from Spanish-speaking countries, and how, this community was drew from English speakers who either were longtime members of this community or were newer residents. So perhaps the gentrifiers, right? Newer residents who had a similar profile of high levels of formal education, access to resources. Often these families tended to be white. And this program drew from a population of Spanish speakers who in this particular area were recent immigrants from different Central American countries and from Mexico as well. And one thing I learned through doing research with parents is that, one, the experiences that recent Latina immigrant mothers talked to me about necessitated a really particular focus, and much more than what traditional coding could bring me, which led me to the work in Anthropoesia that I've published before, that really highlighted, it wasn't just about interviewing parents and their experience with this particular school, but it meant interviewing them about their life experiences, which included migration and the huge impact of migration in their lives, and how for some of them, being in this program was kind of by chance. This is the school that was around the corner, and this is where they enrolled. And they had the luck to have the one Spanish-speaking counseling assistant in the office the day they registered. So they knew there was this bilingual classroom available. And I think, even though I didn't look at it through this lens, but Adriana, when you talk about trust and distrust, one of the number one things that came out in all my interviews with the Latino parents was how much they trusted the teacher. The teacher is a Venezuelan, at that time was a Venezuelan woman who did so much to connect with Latino immigrant parents. So much so that she burnt out after 4 years, of not having a lot of support, but because she was doing both, right? She was supporting the Latino immigrant parents, and she was also catering to the needs of a lot of the white middle class parents. And she was, for 4 years burnt out. But this idea of trust, and for some of the parents, obviously the bilingualism was important, but being able to talk to the teacher was important. And again, because this is sort of a newer context for Spanish immigrants in this large city, there weren't many Spanish speaking folks in the school at all. Right. And so this idea of being heard and being able to communicate with the teacher. And so, the idea of how much they trusted the teacher and how happy they were with the program had so much to do with that. Right. Being able to make a meaningful connection. And even though the principal didn't speak Spanish, many parents talked highly about him just because he had the willingness to listen. But I think another aspect of my research that came out is just some of what Idalia and Suzanne, you were mentioning about how for parents of color, especially recent Latino immigrants, there's this discourse of English only, right? There's this discourse of, ya estás en los Estados Unidos y ahora tus hijos tienen que aprender inglés. And a discourse that comes from within the community, right? ¿Por qué los tienes en el programa de español? No, no, no. Tú les enseñas español en la casa, el inglés en la escuela, right? And so there were different viewpoints about where the most appropriate place to teach and learn Spanish was, right? You know, there was one particular parent who was like, eso déjaselo a los gringos. That program is for the gringos, right? Like, you know, and so it was just interesting how there were just different viewpoints. And even getting the program started, some of the Latina women who were key in gathering signatures of support said they had to go elsewhere because some of the parents in that school just found it odd that they wanted to create, you know, a Spanish bilingual program. And they're like, pues ya hablamos español, lo que necesitamos es el inglés, right? And so, you know, that was one of the things. And of course, the context is important here because a lot of these families that were part of the initial cohorts in this school were recent Latino immigrants. Once the word started getting out around the city, folks from different areas of the city started to come here, right? And started to say, wow, we, you know, bilingualism is important to us. And so, you know, I think as, you know, and I haven't done research since then, but I know that maybe the families that now attend the school, the Spanish speaking families or the Latino families, perhaps are more diverse in their composition. And some of the data that I haven't analyzed from the second cohort of Latinos and parents of color is one thing that I think also in our panel is probably becoming very evident is that Latinos are not a monolithic group. And parents deal with really different discourses depending on how they're positioned, right? And so I had a Puerto Rican mother who was driving from a different part of the city for her children to attend this school. And she talked more about like, you know, linguistic ideologies that she grew up with as a Puerto Rican child and, you know, what counts as good Spanish and what counts as good English, right? And how she wanted that for her children because she didn't have that, right? Or because that's what she was exposed to, right? These puristic linguistic ideologies, right? Of how languages should be spoken, right? And so I think one of the things that is important to highlight is just the diversity within Latino parents that are enrolled in different bilingual programs, and again, depending on their racial and you know, ethno-racial positioning, their socioeconomic positioning, their migratory trajectories. It's, you know, they're diverse worlds, and it's key for educators and researchers to understand these, right? Because bilingualism will have a different place depending on a lot of these, and parents are going to be fighting different discourses around that as well.
That's, something that you mentioned reminded me of one of the things that we found, Sophia, is that we're coming at it, and by we, I mean Latinx people, right, who are bilingual in these dual language programs, from a nuanced stance, in the sense that, I'll give you a couple of examples. The parents in our study, especially the second gen parents that I spoke to, were saying it's not so much about how we use language, whether it's Spanish or English time. It's more about fomenting this like cultural investment in becoming bilingual. So one particular mother said, I can't keep telling my kids speak Spanish, because she said, we live in this bilingual world, you know, we're Mexican American. And so she was teaching her about Dia de los Muertos, right? And using all the artifacts around Dia de los Muertos to have them feel invested in speaking Spanish. Another parent said, sometimes I notice that people are uncomfortable when I'm speaking to my child in Spanish. She's like, so I'll purposely speak just a little louder because it's my language. I can speak what I want. And in fact, that's the rationale she gave to the person that asked her to speak English. She said, I am actually bilingual and I just so happen to be speaking Spanish right now. So things like that, as a parent who had children in dual language programs, I would have similar conversations. And I think that's the piece that's kind of missing, right? That piece where we want bilingualism for different reasons, not just to be bilingual, right? We have cultural connections to the language as well.
I wanted to touch back on one of Sophie's points about trust and how those teachers fostered that sense of trust and connected to the work that I'm currently doing. Among the 25 interviews with parents and like 27 with teachers, we wanted also to highlight and learn what are those factors that are fostering a sense of trust? Like, what are parents sharing? What experiences count as an experience of feeling trust and belonging in schools? And although language was mentioned, the highest pattern that we saw was small gestures, fostering a genuine, authentic intention of listening and getting to know parents that goes beyond academics. What Angela Valenzuela would call aesthetic care, right? And so we found that when parents shared the moments of trust, it went down to the smallest, tiniest details, as a smile. Oh, the teacher tried to speak Spanish. She sent me a postcard, a phone call to ask about my personal life. So it was those moments that were fostering trust. So it makes me think and connect back to what what all of you are saying, really, and how we take for granted that, like, just the smallest gesture and the tones and dispositions was also something that was very common in the responses, meaning that the parents felt that tones and dispositions were patronizing, judgmental, lacked humility. There were always positioning of knowing more with arrogance, deficit views, of course, and even threatening. As I'll just share an example with a mother who took her child to school for the first time. And when she was sharing her moment of distrust, we asked her to describe, when have you felt distrust in schools? And she said that the first day of school, she's just learning to navigate the system. It's a lot. The little girl, it's also her first day. She was late to pick up her daughter. She made a mistake with the schedule. And when she came back, she was told, I can call the police right now if you do not arrive, when she was called on the phone. So imagine like this experience. And so I know that our theme is bilingualism, but it is all completely interweaved, and these tones and dispositions are part of it.
Yeah, there's like a hyper surveillance on Latino parents all the time, and at different levels and on different things, right? It's language, it's race, it's nationality, it's immigration status. There's just so much surveillance that have to do a lot with that distrust, o esa falta de confianza, ¿no? Que no podemos crear those bonds that we need.
And those interactions, Adriana, in some of the anthropoesia work that I did, it was just those interactions with office staff, and that are moments, interactional moments that are so powerful, right? That can, like our colleague, Dr. Manuel Espinosa, talks a lot about dignity, and how dignity, even though it's like an inalienable quality of all human beings, it's also experienced through interaction or not experienced. And how every single interaction can make you feel like, like I'm worthy of this person's time, or I'm not worthy of this person's time. And some of the parents in my data were very explicit of saying, one mother was like, pues nosotros a veces no hablamos el inglés perfecto, pero también ellos no ponen de su parte, right? She was like, I go to the front staff and I'm trying to communicate. And when they tell me, I don't understand your English because you don't speak it how I do, it's like, that's racism. Like, I'm trying my best. And she's like, that's why sometimes Latino parents, we say we don't speak English, but we actually understand and know more, but we're embarrassed because of these situations. Yeah.
Yeah, it should be a bi-directional relationship, right? O sea, no es nomás dar, es también recibir. I felt like with the mothers that I was talking to, there was different layers of borders that they were facing. So they had literally the physical border, right? So cada mañana tenían que cruzar la frontera. And then there's these other borders, like como dices, the staff, the teacher, all these things that they're constantly facing, telling them, you know, you're either not involved or you're not welcome here, or you're just not part of this community. And that's been ingrained into our communities historically. There's a historical perspective on that too, that we can look at, and how generations of family will let each other know, like, this is how it works, right? This is our role. No nos ven, no participamos, no nos hablan porque vivimos en México y nuestro número de teléfono es mexicano, no es americano. So there's just so many ways that parents deal with that distrust, that desconfianza.
And I was thinking about what everybody's saying about these borders. We've mentioned structural borders, literal borders, physical borders, and then there's figurative borders, right? This idea of being constantly feeling like you're being surveilled. And I keep thinking, you know, what do we want for parents of color in bilingual education? Where do we see this going? I know there's certainly advocacy work that needs to be done that speaks to our communities. And I think it needs to happen, and it needs to happen now. I was on a phone call for a radio and promoting dual language education, bilingual education here in California. And this father called in and said, yo llegué en los 90s y me dijeron que hable español. No tenían programas bilingües. And he said, y ahora me estás diciendo que quieren el español de mi hijo. And he's like, no, pues no. And that really hit a chord for me. And I was like, he's right. Like, we're not selling dual language education or by any bilingual program in the same way as we are other groups, right? And that's part of the reason why I wanted us to come together, is to really name that and say that and share what we envision for communities of color.
Yeah, well, part I think of why I am really focusing on this work on trust and distrust is that those interactions that Sophia was talking about are scarring. Like, I know we all must have our scars from our own experiences, right? And so, and I bet that if I ask all of you right now to share like a moment of distrust in your schooling experiences, you can think of it like really quickly, or many. And so what I think like one step is that, you know, all these efforts to build trust with families without addressing the distrust is like pushing something that is not advancing, because there's a need to heal those instances, that distrust that has been historically accumulated, and scars, and then multiple scars. And until we hear about distrust and those experiences, then I think we can move towards advancing trust.
And I'll just chime in quickly. It's just so great to hear about all of your papers. And I can't help but think about how Latinx families are hyper surveilled, right? There's this hyper surveillance that Idalia was speaking to, and also hyper invisible, and really depending on the moment and the context, and if they are needed to be commodified, like Suzanne's saying, in like the context of dual language education and our multilingualism for all era in California, which is a blessing in some ways and a curse in some ways, because we're reproducing status quo inequities and power dynamics in these programs, even though at the core they can be anti-racist, they can be focused on social justice, but we're finding a lot of them aren't, right? That they're still reproducing these power dynamics. So I just, it speaks to me. So thank you for sharing your work. I know we'll be hearing from Patricia in a moment. So, but yeah, just looking forward to reading your papers.
Is that my cue? Let me just quickly just say a couple of things, if that's okay, so that the conversation can continue. I think we have time. Thank you again, for the opportunity. Again, my name is Patricia Baquedano Lopez. I'm wearing a dark red top. I have short brown hair. My pronouns are she, her, ella. I identify as Latina. I got the blurred background too. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Muwekma Ohlone people. I recognize that they are the descendants of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County, and that these lands where UC Berkeley, my institution, was built, continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people and their descendants, and it is my duty, my responsibility to do my work so that these lands and so that this knowledge continues for generations to come. So I am, of course, super excited about this panel because in some ways my work overlaps, and the way I look at it is going to be trying to emulate the work that you're doing. So thank you for that guiding light and leadership, and the way you're thinking of new ways to think about bilingual education and the work that immigrant families do. I want to comment on in my own work. I've been for the past 10 years working with indigenous communities from Yucatan in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And there are multiple connections to what you're saying in terms of like this community being subsumed under the broader Latinx community, right? And so I think Sophia was mentioning we're not a monolithic community, so important to tease those differences apart, right? Because they are intersectional in so many ways across the hemisphere, right? So I wanted to comment on 2 points that are surfacing in the papers and kind of picked up a little bit in the work that Adriana was mentioning earlier on in her work, and that is the limiting beliefs that produce racist and exclusionary practices, but that they are also related to the interactions that Latinx families have with other communities of color, in particular Black students, and how over the history of language education in the United States, Black students are not seen as language learners. And Latinx students are kind of always seen as the perennial language learners, right? And so like there are these tensions that have been created through policies, through exclusion, right? And so I just wanted to ask if you could talk about if your work has come across this tension, right? And in so many ways, the Latinx communities have been driving language education takes on a leading role even within this exclusionary context, right? So just wanted to ask about your own work and your contact and work with other communities of color, right? So I think it helps give a sense of the broader context and the larger struggle, right? And the other point I want to mention that you have been talking about in your papers, but also today, was the central role of mothering as a site of political intervention. And in our own families, in your own families, I'm a mother too. And what we have a whole history in educational research on parent engagement. And listening to you and reading your work, I've been thinking more about the ways in which that has had a limiting effect on the role of mothers and of mothering, right? And so just wanted to comment on this point and see if you had any other comments about this reintegration, reimagining, repositioning of motherhood as one of these central driving forces in the change that needs to happen, right? in bilingual education, right? So motherhood as a political intervention.